So Daniel is this fascinating book we find in the Old Testament. It's sort of in between the major prophets, major and minor prophets. And again, major and minor prophets, the only distinction is really their length. It's not major being more important or less important, but it's kind of in between. In the Christian canon, the Christian Bible, it's one way, and in the Hebrew scriptures, if you're just Jewish, it's in a different place. So, really interesting and kind of, and that sort of is a bit of a parable in itself because it's a mysterious book too. It's the only apocalypse in the Old Testament, the only full blown apocalypse in the Old Testament. Now, when we hear the word apocalypse, usually the first thing that probably comes to mind is like the end of the world, right? The end times. Whereas the word apocalypse, apokalypsos in Greek, especially in the New Testament, simply means unveiling, showing what's really there. Does not necessarily mean end of the world exactly. So unveiling of the truth. So Daniel is pretty clearly divided into two parts. 1 through 6 it's a collection of 6 stories about Daniel and his companions, and it sort of sets the table for Daniel to be give some legitimacy to him as this person who receives these visions from God. And chapter 7 through 12 are these four apocalyptic visions from God. Interesting little point is that part of chapters 2 through 8 are written in a language called Aramaic. Now, all of the Old Testament, except for this part, is written in Hebrew, and all of the New Testament is written in Greek. Aramaic is related to Hebrew, but it's kind of got it's sort of a dialect, maybe you'd say, um, of sort of an offshoot of Hebrew. It's actually the language Jesus spoke, and it's interesting. It's written in Aramaic. So Daniel, the book, was likely written somewhere between 150 and 100 BC, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, under the rule of the Greek tyrant king Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Or it's basically, and I spelled that wrong. There's a different kind of Epiphanes, no I in there. Anyway, um, there we go. So Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, that's how they would spell that, is put the fourth in the middle. Antiochus Epiphanes was a Greek tyrant king. Um, so it's almost certainly written during or after his reign, um, because the visions that Daniel receives are so specific in the actions that are being undertaken by the king that either this was some prophecy that became true in the sense that it was the specific events, which is unlikely given the way that biblical prophecy tends to work in the Old Testament, or it's written during his reign, and then the story is set a few hundred years before under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar during the Babylonian exile. So Nebuchadnezzar and Antiochus Epiphanes are both these sort of tyrant kings. And you can imagine you've got people who've told this story. It's part of they've sat around campfires and told this story about there was this king a couple hundred years ago named Nebuchadnezzar, and he was terrible, and he was violent and awful. And that sounds a little bit like what we're dealing with now with Antiochus Epiphanes. And so they write the story during Antiochus Epiphanes, but the story itself is set in Nebuchadnezzar's time, and they try to glean something from their past story to help them deal with what's going on now. Is kind of the way I would frame that. So, and it reminded Antiochus reminded them of exile. So Antiochus Epiphanes means God manifest. So this king said, "I am God. I am God." That's what he said. And he was just terrifyingly awful. he outlawed all Jewish practices and attempted to have a genocide of the Jews and totally wipe them out. It was basically um, become just renounce your Judaism or die. That was the choice. Um, so that's where they're living under here. Um, Daniel chapter 3 is one of the most, for me, the most poignant stories in Scripture. It not talked about a whole lot, but it is. I don't know if I'd say it's my favorite because it's sort of a um, it's terrifyingly awful and hopeful at the same time, but it's poignant for me, significant for me. It's these three Jewish guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're faithful Jews. The Veggie Tales, very few remember Veggie Tales. The Veggie Tales version of their names are Rakshak and Benny. So Rakshak and Benny are, with everybody else, are called to the king, stand in front of the king, and he's had this 50-foot tall golden statue of himself um, built. He's commissioned this, and then he says to all of his subjects, he says, "You must bow down to this statue of me, or you'll be killed." Which talk about being full of yourself. Oh my goodness. And he says, if you don't bow down, you're going to be thrown into the furnace and you're going to burn to death. And Rakshak and Benny don't bow down. Everybody else is down on their hands and knees. I mean, there's got to be, tens of thousands of people down on their hands and knees bowing, and Rakshak and Benny don't bow. And he says, those three out there, they're not bowing. Go force them to bow. And they don't bow, and they're thrown into the furnace. And for not bowing. And they're thrown into the furnace, but miraculously they don't burn. And so he says, turn up the heat, make it hotter in there, make them burn. And in fact, it gets so hot that the guy who's throwing the coals on to make it burn hotter, he himself burns to death. And the people see that it's not just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire, but a fourth figure appears, and they come out. The three of them come out not burning, and the kind of takeaway is that there's, God is with them. So that fourth figure is God is with them, and Nebuchadnezzar converts himself. So Daniel has so much to say to us about the sort of powers of the world, the kingdom of the world. There's this point where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego particularly are looking at this fiery furnace and this 50-foot tall statue, golden statue of the king, and all these other people, everybody else is bowing down, and still they say, we are more in awe of God than we are of you. And so we don't submit to you, we submit to God. They are being, frankly, unpatriotic. They're not supporting their king. They're not supporting sort of the ways of the world. They submit to God instead. And for them, there's a very clear division. For them, being a faithful Jew meant being an unfaithful citizen, and it was very clear for them. And we have to wrestle with that. I think. To what extent do we, as Christians, maybe we don't always find ourselves in that particular exact scenario, but to what extent do we have to be careful about submitting ourselves to the empire rather than to Jesus? Sometimes the line's kind of gray there, and sometimes it's not. But anyway, there's this for the Jews in Daniel, navigating, trying to find, who am I? What's my identity? Who are we? Even when they're displaced, even when they're in exile, and it's holding up this both vulnerability and confidence in one hand, and fear and hope in the other hand. So, some kind of underlying questions: how can Jews live faithfully under foreign rulers? Is there an alternative to assimilation other than martyrdom? When and how will God assert sovereignty and deliver the Jews? And finally, how is God's sovereignty upheld now and then? So those are sort of underlying questions throughout Daniel. And then the bigger picture then is throughout Daniel, and really we see this throughout all of Scripture, is this sort of rise and fall of human kingdoms, right? The people that we think are the most powerful end up falling eventually. And throughout it all, steadily, God's kingdom remains. So Daniel, wonderfully important book, underread book, but I hope it's impactful and meaningful for you.